It's day 2 of Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers. Today we get a Bat God, some busted vampires, and even a Mythic Dragon Dinosaur. Let's break them down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers, and we have some really sweet cards to talk about today. This set looks so cool and so powerful, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking spicy new Magic cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Lost Caverns of Ixalan. So first up today, we got a new Mythic Vampire Demon in Bloodletter of Aclazotz. And this card, I think, is way stronger than it's getting credit for. So it is a 4-mana 2/4 flyer. It has 3 black mana symbols. It's going to have to be black heavy. It is a non-legendary vampire demon. In 2023, being non-legendary, actually notable. And its ability is, if an opponent would lose life during your turn, they lose twice that much life instead. And then reminder text that damage does indeed cause loss of life. So this card, I think, at first glance, you're kind of like, okay, whatever. 4-mana 2/4, that's not really that exciting. But when you think about it, at least on offense, this is actually kind of a 4-mana 4/4, because if it gets in damage, it's going to be doubled instead, because your opponent's losing life and it's triggering its ability. So I think this card might actually be way stronger than people think. If you think about comparisons, black has similar effects, like wound reflection, but traditionally when black is doing this double up life loss thing, it triggers on the end step rather than immediately. So that's already a big upgrade. This is kind of like a wound reflection effect, but it's formatted more like a red damage doubler, where it's just dealing twice as much damage right away rather than having to wait to your end step for something to go wrong. So I think this card might actually be pretty powerful. So where does this card actually fit? So it's a vampire. You can play it in vampires, and that would be fine. I mean, it works well with any deck that's being aggressive. Like if you're attacking a lot and draining your opponent, it's going to be strong. One of the cool tricks of Bloodletter is it doesn't double damage. It doubles life loss, which means it works with stuff like Vron. Vron has an ability where when a creature dies once per turn, each opponent loses 2, you gain 2. Well, if you have Bloodletter out when a creature dies, that's actually going to be 4 for a single creature dying, which is kind of ridiculous. But I'm not sure this is even really a vampire card. I think this is just like a black aggro style card. Like, I'm mostly excited to play this in just a generic black deck where you're like Tenacious Underdog, hits for 6 now, Graveyard Trespasser, when it exiles something from the graveyard, drains for 2 now. Doesn't actually work specifically with Shieldred, since the life loss is happening on your opponent's turn. In general, the life loss being doubled only during your turn really doesn't matter, because 99% of the time you're going to be like damaging your opponent during your turn anyway. You're going to be attacking them and doing things during your turn. So most of the time that really doesn't make a difference. It does make a difference with Shieldred in specific. It doesn't double up the drain from Shieldred if your opponent's drawing the cards during their turn. Can it compete with Shieldred? I guess that's the big question. Whenever I see a black 4-drop, my first thought is, okay, this card's really sweet, but is it Shieldred sweet? And I think in some decks the answer can be yes. Like, this is a really aggressively costed flyer with a really powerful ability. What I'm really excited for is playing this in Black Devotion, though. That is probably the best trick for this deck. I play Black Devotion a lot in like Historic and Explore, and Bloodletter is like built to work with Great Merchant of Asphodel. So Great Merchant of Asphodel, ETBs, each opponent loses life equal to your devotion to black. So even if you have no other black cards on the battlefield, which is not very likely, just Bloodletter plus Great Merchant is going to be 5. So you're going to drain your opponent for 5, but no, it's actually doubled up by Bloodletter. So with just Bloodletter and Great Merchant, you're going to drain for 10, and then you're going to gain 10, which is ridiculous. Plus, Bloodletter is adding 4 pips to the battlefield for like Nykthos and all those shenanigans. So this is one of the best Black Devotion cards I think we've ever seen because of how it synergizes with Great Merchant. This also means it works with a bunch of big commander finishers. Exsanguinate, for example, wouldn't work with a damage doubler, but it's gonna work with Bloodletter. So if you can Exsanguinate for like 10 and hit each opponent for 10, that's gonna be doubled up to 20, and each opponent's gonna take 20, and you're gonna gain 60 life, which is absurd. Or like Torment of Hailfire, another life loss effect, being doubled up by Bloodletter, kind of ridiculous when your opponent has to take 6 for each time they choose the lose life mode. So I think this card has a home in a lot of commander decks. decks. You can play it in Black Devotion decks, like we were talking about. Like, if I'm playing a commander deck that's playing Grey Merchant, I'm going to be playing Bloodletter. I don't really even care what the archetype is. They just work so well together. It also works really well with some demons. That's the other creature type on this card. Not as relevant for standard, but in commander, like really getting Rakdos. Rakdos is about damaging your opponent during your turn as a ramp effect. Gonna get double the damage with Bloodletter. Obnixilus the Black Oath is often a demon commander that has a draining +2. Carter Doomscourge, really good at dealing a bunch of damage during your turn because of its attack ability. It also seems really sweet in like Veto, for example. Other life gain shenanigan decks like Asterion, doubling up the life loss with Asterion seems ridiculous. And then just like aggro vampire decks, Drana, Olivia. So I think that Bloodletter, I think this card's actually just legitimately really strong. Do not sleep on this card. Yes, it doesn't have an ETB trigger. Yes, it dies to Doomblade, of course, but we've seen with Sheoldred that a card can still succeed, even if it doesn't have an enter the battlefield trigger, and I think this is on the same list. The synergy with Grey Merchant is so strong, and there's just so much damage potential in this card that I would be really surprised if it doesn't find a home, at least in Standard, definitely in Commander, and maybe even in formats like Pioneer as well in Black Devotion decks. Speaking of Mythics, we also got a Dragon Dinosaur in Bonehoard Dracosaur, and this is another card. It's gotta be good, right? It's gotta be good. So it's a 5-mana 5/5 Dragon Dinosaur with flying and first strike. So already really good stats. And then its ability is, at the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play them this turn. So it's drawing you 2 cards a turn, essentially, impulse drawing them. And then if you exile the land, you make a 3/1 red dinosaur creature token. And if you exile the non-land, you get a treasure token. So in theory, what is going to happen most of the time is you play this. If it survives to your first upkeep, you're going to draw 2 cards, most likely make a 3/1, and get a treasure token. That is an absurd amount of value. And if it sticks around for another turn, it's going to happen again, and it's going to happen again. So this is a card, my first thought was, okay, this is kind of like a Baneslayer Angel, in the sense that it's this big 5-drop first striking flyer. So it's already got good stats there. Bad news is, Baneslayer hasn't really seen much play the last times it's been in Standard. It's got a little bit of like Goldspan built in with the treasure production, a little bit of Verdant Force built in with the token production, a bunch of really powerful comparisons. The only question is this one of those cards where the dies to Doomblade thing is too much of a problem? If you had asked me about this card a year ago, I'd be like, okay, this card's really powerful, but it has to sit on the battlefield. Is it really going to sit on the battlefield? But as we've seen with Sheoldred, cards can be really good, even if they have to sit on the battlefield for a turn or two. And I think that Bonehoard is in that Sheoldred camp. It's in that camp where if this sticks on the battlefield, it's probably going to win you the game with card advantage, with tokens, with mana productions. Like, if this sticks out, it does so much of what you want that I think, at least as far as Standard is concerned, even though, yes, there's going to be games when you play it and it immediately gets hit by a Leyline Binding or immediately gets hit by some other removal spell and you're going to be really sad, the upside of this is so immense that your opponent can't kill everything, right? So if this is the thing that sticks, it's just going to win you the game on its own, similar to how Sheoldred does. Plus, in Standard, we do have dragon synergies, Rivaz of the Claw, Sarkhan Soul of Flame. This is another very competitively costed dragon, and we know we're going into Ixalan and getting a bunch of dinosaur stuff as well. We haven't seen like too many dinosaurs yet. We saw the Gishath reprint, obviously. So this has 2 potential homes based on its creature types that may be really relevant in Standard. It could also just be a generic good card. Like if you're playing Rakdos midrange and you're just like, okay, I'm going to play all the blackest Rakdos cards, all the best removal, and I'm going to say, if you can answer all my stuff, then good, you got me. Like, remember, we're in a pretty mid-rangey format. We've been in this mid-range powerful card format for a while. Bonehoard Dracosaur seems fine there as well. Like, Blood Tithe Harvester, Sheoldred, Stick My Bonehoard. Can you possibly kill all of it? If I just present a really bomby threat every single turn, yes, maybe those threats need to stick around to be maximum as far as their power, but can you really answer all of them? That's what we saw with, like, Fable of the Mirror Breaker. You just demand so many answers that eventually something's gonna stick, and if that thing is Bonehoard, it's gonna win you the game. I also really like how this interacts with stuff like Quintorius Con and PNLR, the whole good and prosper thing. But we keep getting like more and more cards that care about playing spells from exile. Quintorius Con, gonna drain whenever you cast a spell from exile. P is going to make Thopters when you play a spell from exile. And this is impulse drawing to every single turn it sticks on the battlefield with a bunch of upside, like making mana for you to cast the cards, which I think means it actually is good and prosper. I know every time an impulse draw effect is printed, people say, oh, it's gonna be good and prosper. Well, the thing is, even if you're playing Commander, you only have like, what, 60 non-land slots or something? You can't play every card that says Impulse Straw on it. It's just not possible. But I think Bonehoard Dracosaur actually is good in Prosper. I think the Impulse Straw 2, the big flying body, and the treasure production and the token production, when you add all that together, unlike a lot of good in Prosper cards that actually don't make the cut, I think this is a good in Prosper card, or maybe good in Rocco, maybe that's the new one, that actually is strong enough to make the cut. So Bonehoard Dracosaur, the card's kind of ridiculous. Like, it's a lot of power, it's a lot of abilities. Yes, it's got to stick on the battlefield, but if it does stick, it is going to take over the game super quick. We also got our black mythic god, our bat god, Aclazotz Deepest Betrayal, which flips into Temple of the Dead. So Aclazotz, 5 mana 4/4 legendary bat god. It has flying and lifelink. When it attacks, each opponent discards a card. For each opponent who can't, you get to draw a card. Whenever an opponent discards a land card, you make a 1/1 bat creature token with flying. And then when it dies, it comes back as a land tapped. Temple of the Dead, the one thing I will say about Temple of the Dead, yes, it makes a black mana, that's great. It is one of the trickier gods to flip back around because to retransform it, it requires a player to have one or fewer cards in hand. So if you're playing Aclazotz, you're probably a discard deck, which helps, but compared to some of the other gods, I think this is going to be one of the harder ones to flip back into god form, which actually makes me think this card might not be that strong out of the gods we've seen so far. I mean, it's fun and it's cool, and it is a 5 mana 4/4 flying lifelinker with a bunch of upsides, but I'm not sure this card is that push. So it compares most obviously to the Haunt of Hightower, a 6-drop vampire that when it attacks, defending player discards a card, and then when a card goes in an opponent's graveyard for any or you get a counter on it. Aclazotz is kind of similar to that, I would say, and Haunt of Hightower really didn't do anything in standards. He's just fringe playing commander. I think Aclazotz, it's definitely an upgrade in several ways. I mean, it's cheaper. If it dies, it flips into a land, but it's still kind of along the same veins. I think one of the comparisons I've seen for this is Waste Not, and it's kind of like Waste Not, but really it is like the worst Waste Not of all time because its ability that triggers based on opponent discarding a card specifically only cares about land cards. So your opponent can discard spells and creatures and planeswalkers, and it kind of does nothing. And its first ability that makes your opponent discard a card, and if they can't, you draw a card, that doesn't trigger on any card draw. That's just on its attack ability. So it's like a super duper restricted pseudo Waste Not. The big upside, of course, is it is a big flying lifelinking body. So I don't want to make it sound like this card is bad, but I don't think I would jam this in like my historic Waste Not deck or my Pioneer Waste Not deck. I think it's just like too slow and too restricted and too clunky. You could build a cool discard deck in standard. There's not a like ton of payoffs for discard, but the Raven Man cares about things being discarded. Painful Quandary, kind of a funny payoff for me punishing your opponent either with life loss or discarding as they cast spells. So maybe we can build a cool Aclazotz deck in standard. I don't know if it'd be all that competitive, but it would probably be kind of fun. As far as actually being a competitive card, I think it's competing most with Sheoldred, not Sheoldred the Apocalypse, but just Sheoldred in standard. I would imagine that Sheoldred probably wins out. Like, Sheoldred just comes down, it has evasion, it makes your opponent sacrifice something right away. This has to come down, it kind of needs to attack. They're flipping it back around. It's going to be tricky because you got to get your opponent low on cards or you low on cards where you don't want to be. So I'm not sure this is really a competitive card. Where I do think it'll shine, though, is in discard decks in Commander. It's formatted in a way that it works really well in Commander because when it attacks, each opponent discards a card, and then you could potentially be drawing like 3 cards each turn cycle if your opponents can't discard a card because they're empty-handed. And then plus in Commander, the odds that at least one of your opponents, or maybe 2 of your opponents, or maybe all 3 of your opponents discard a land goes up significantly. Like if this is I attack, each opponent discards a land, I make 3 bats, that's pretty good. If it's I attack, my opponents are empty-handed, I draw 3 cards, that's ridiculous. So I think this is an easy inclusion for like Tiny Bones or Turgid or Turok or the Raven Man. You could also play it as your commander if you wanted to, do some sort of like bat discard themed deck. Although just on power level, Tiny Bones and Turgid are pretty busted. So I definitely think as a commander, as a discard commander, Aclazotz is more in the like Raven Man, Turok tier rather than the like S+ tier Tiny Bones Turgid just on power level. So Aclazotz, it's fine. Out of all the gods we've seen so far, this might be the one I'm least excited for, but hey, it's still a huge lifelinking flyer, so it can't be that bad, right? We also got a new Merfolk enchantment in Deeproot Pilgrimage. So Deeproot Pilgrimage, 2-mana enchantment says, whenever one or more non-token merfolk you control become tapped, make a 1/1 blue merfolk creature token with hexproof. So let's get this out of the way first. As far as comparisons, this is kind of like Deeproot Waters. That's the first thing I thought of. Deeproot Waters came out last Ixalan, and it's whenever you cast a merfolk, you make a 1/1 hexproof merfolk. This was a card that got some hype for Modern when it was first previewed, and then it turns out it is just totally not worth it in Modern Merfolk, and I think the same is true of Deeproot Pilgrimage. I think this is a card that you're going to see some hype about for like, oh, I can play this in Modern Merfolk, hexproof, it doesn't get hit by Fury or whatever, but in reality, if you look at Modern Merfolk, there's just no room for this card. There's so many 2-mana lords that you just have to be playing. Lord of Atlantis, Master of the Pearl Trident, Voldaren Hexcatcher, even stuff like Merfolk Mistbinder doesn't make the cut in Merfolk just because you have so many other lords already. Plus you need Merfolk Trickster, you probably need some Silver Gill Adepts. The 2-drop slot is just already so full of so strong of cards that it's hard for me to imagine a 2-mana enchantment that you gotta play and then probably attack with something to actually make a 1/1, even with hexproof. It's just not gonna make the cut in my opinion. So I think this is one of the cards that people get a little hyped about for Modern Merfolk, try in Modern Merfolk, and then realize, okay, like I should just be playing more Lord of Atlantises and Merfolk Tricksters because those cards are better. On the other hand, the equation is much different in Standard. In Standard, we do have a Merfolk Lord in Voldaren Hexcatcher, and then we also have some pretty good Merfolk 1-drops, and this is where Deeproot Pilgrimage is going to be at its best, is when you play like a Senonite Scout on turn 1, just a 1/1 that explores, get your card advantage, maybe get a counter on it, turn 2 drop the Deeproot Pilgrimage, attack with your Scout, get the first hexproof thing, and start that snowball going. So because we have Jadelight Splunker, we have Senonite Scout, I think that Deeproot Pilgrim probably actually going to be very good in Standard Merfolk. In older formats, there's also some janky combo potential, so this is probably mostly stuff you do in Commander. The one that's hard to do in Commander is 2 Kiora's Followers. Kiora Follower, a 2-drop Merfolk that taps to untap another target permanent. If you have 2 of them, you tap one to untap the other one, and back and forth, infinite Merfolk tokens. Gonna be hard to do in Commander, although you can pull it off with a clone. If you play Kiora's Follower and then clone it and then have Deeproot Pilgrimage, then you can do the infinite untap thing, infinite Merfolk. Also goes infinite with Intruder Alarm in a bunch of different ways. Like maybe you have Drowner of Secrets, a Merfolk that says tap a Merfolk you control to mill a card, and then you have Intruder Alarm. You can tap the Drowner of Secrets to make someone mill a card. That's going to make the token with Deeproot Pilgrimage, which will trigger Intruder Alarm to untap the Drowner of Secrets, and then you tap it again and you tap it again, so you get infinite mill, also infinite Merfolk. Also really cute with Cryptolith Rites. Remember, blue-green is kind of the Merfolk color now. We have a lot of good green Merfolk, especially in Commander. So being in green is not all that unrealistic, but if you can give your Merfolk tap to make a mana, Deeproot Pilgrimage becomes kind of insane, because you can tap a Merfolk to make a mana, that's going to make a token, that's going to untap the Merfolk, so you make infinite mana, you make infinite Merfolk, you kind of just win the game if you have Deeproot Pilgrimage and Cryptolith Rites and a non-token Merfolk on the battlefield. As far as Commander is concerned, I would play this in probably any blue-green Merfolk deck. I think it's just going to be worth it, especially since it's going to be very easy to slot these combos into your Commander deck, and that's going to give you a different line of attack. It's not just, oh, spew a bunch of Merfolk and hope for the best. You're going to have this combo potential where you actually just go infinite and win the game. It's going to be at its best, though, in Kumana. Kumana is, like, built for this card, because Kumana is a Merfolk legend that also has a bunch of abilities that care about tapping Merfolk, tapping them to make it unblockable or draw cards or put counters on things. So as you're doing your Kumana stuff that you want to do anyway, you're also just going to be making all these Merfolk with Deeproot Pilgrimage, which then also fuel the Kumana, giving you more Merfolk to tap so you can activate Kumana more. So it seems like one of the best cards you can play in Kumana Merfolk. So Deeproot Pilgrimage, I like it for Standard. I like its combo potential in Commander. Modern, I'm not convinced it's going to make the cut, but we'll see. I expect people will try it at least. Next up, we got a new black rare in Bringer of the Last Gift. So if you read Mark Rosewater's teaser about Lost Caverns of Ixalan, he promised that we'd be getting a creature, I believe, that was based on an iconic or popular spell from Tempest. Well, it appears that that is Bringer of the Last Gift. So Bringer of the Last Gift, it's essentially Living Death, but on a 8-mana 6/6 creature. So 8-mana 6/6 Vampire Demon. It has flying. It says when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, each player sacrifices all the other creatures they control. Then each player returns all creature cards from the graveyard that weren't put this way to the battlefield. So essentially, when you cast Bringer of the Last Gifts, it survives, everything else gets sacrificed, and then everyone returns all the creatures that weren't just sacrificed to Bringer of the Last Gift to the battlefield, which means it's essentially Living Death, with its formatting updated for 2023 on this big flying body. My question for this card is it just too expensive? It's not very abusable. We've seen a lot of these big black demons and dragons. They have this cast restriction. Reaver Demon blows up everything. Cacodemon blows up everything. Deathbringer Regent blows up everything. Bringer's kind of in the same vein, and none of these cards have ever really taken off in 60 card formats, just because it's such a big restriction of needing to cast this 8-drop, and you can't really abuse it by blinking it or reanimating it or everything. So I imagine this probably isn't really built for 60 card formats. I think it's more of a commander card. That said, I mean, if you can cast this, it can do ridiculous things. Like, this can wrath the board and reanimate Atraxas, Atalis, so maybe it could be like a one-of backup to Cruelty of Grix or Lich Knight's Conquest. Although it is worth pointing out, it does reanimate your opponent's graveyard as well, so keep that in mind. That's one of the issues with Living Death, is sometimes if your opponent's also playing a graveyard deck, you can't cast it because it's going to benefit them as much as it benefits you, so keep that in mind. There is a bit of a risk there. I think where this card will be sweet, though, is in Demon Commander deck. So in Commander, Demons are already super expensive. You're in black, so you got graveyard themes. I imagine this is a card that you play in your Bellicor deck or Rakdos deck, or maybe Carrick Demons can ramp into it, get the cost down a little bit with its Phyrexian mana thing. And this is just like your finisher. You do all your demoning stuff, your board gets Wrath, and you bring her to get everything back and take over the game with this huge board of demons. So Bringer of the Last Gift, I mean, at 8 mana and with the cast restriction, I'd be surprised if this was a standard staple. Not to say it was unplayable or anything. Like I said, it could be a one-of in some sort of reanimator deck, but I think this is a very sweet commander card that will show up in demon decks and maybe in vampire decks as well. Speaking of vampires, we got one that I'm actually pretty hyped about for standard in Preacher of the Schism. So Preacher of the Schism, 3 mana 2/4 vampire cleric with Death Touch. It's a black card. It says, when it attacks a player with the most life or tied for the most life, you create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. When it attacks, while you have the most life or tied for the most life, you draw a card and lose a life. So Preacher of the Schism, in 1v1 formats, essentially, if your opponent's behind on life, it's going to take and draw you cards. If you're behind on life, it's going to make lifelink vampires, which is actually kind of what you want. Like, if you're about to die, a lifelinking jump blocker seems pretty good. Plus, the big selling point of this card for me is going to be its stats with the Death Touch. I think that's what makes me excited about this card. A 2/4 3-mana Death Toucher actually lines up pretty well with standard. If you think about the big black 3-drops, Graveyard Trespasser, 3/3, Lord Skitter, 3/3, and then you got stuff like Tenacious Underdog, a 3/2, Godric, if it's not in flying mode, is a 3/3. These are some of the really popular standard creatures. A 2/4 Death Toucher tangles really well with them. Sure, you're not getting in as much damage on offense because you only have 2 power, but on defense, this just kills all of these cards and survives because of that 4 toughness. So being a 2/4 is actually a really sweet spot to be. Plus, of course, because of the Death Touch, it'll take down big things. It'll take down Sheoldred or a Tally or whatever. So I really like the 2/4 Death Touch stats. Its ability, it's essentially Dethrone, almost, like a twist on Dethrone like we see with Marchesa, which in Commander, I love this mechanic in Commander because it encourages you mostly to attack the person who has the highest life total to get the reward. So it encourages you to, like, not just zero in on one person and take them out of the game, but kind of spread the love based on who's winning. In 1v1 formats, we've never really seen these cards before. It's kind of like a 1v1 twist on this, where the fact that it's going to work no matter what. The problem with Dethrone is, if you have the highest life total, then Dethrone doesn't do anything, because Preacher actually does something if you are at the highest life total. Not just something, but something really powerful in drawing a card and losing a life. This is actually a really good 1v1 card. If you think about this, it's kind of like Adeleine. If you're attacking the player with the most life, you get the 1/1 token. And then it's also kind of like Glissa, is this annoying to block card advantage engine if you're the one with the most life. Those are 2 very good cards that this compares to. I think Preacher of the Schism is on the same level as the premier black 3-drops in the format. The Lord Skitters, the Graveyard Trespassers, the Glissa the Sunslayers. I think this card is just as good. The problem is, much like Glissa, you do need to start attacking with it for it to do anything. Graveyard, Lord Skitter, they kind of do something right away with their abilities, but we've seen Glissa really take off since we had Wilds of Eldraine release, and I think Preacher can do something very, very similar, where this is a threat that is just almost always going to be good. It's good on defense, it's good on offense, it draws cards, it makes tokens, so I think Preacher of the Schism, it's another one of those cards that you look at and you're like, okay, that looks fine, but when you actually dig into the combination of big stats and death touch and abilities, seems like a very playable constructed card to me. We also got a weird one, an Unstable Glyph Bridge, which can craft into Roaming Sandspout Glyph. So, front side of this card, 5-mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, for each player, choose a creature with power 2 or less they control, then destroy all the rest of the creatures. And then you can craft with an artifact, so exile an artifact from your graveyard or battlefield, pay 5 mana with this, and you get the backside, which is Roaming Sandspout Glyph, a 5/3 flying golem that says, whenever an opponent casts a spell during their turn, they can't attack you or a planeswalker you control this turn, and each opponent who attacked you or a planeswalker you control this turn can't cast spells this turn. So essentially, the backside makes your opponents choose, do I cast spells this turn or do I attack you this turn? Which is actually pretty sweet. Like, that's a tough choice. I mean, the downside is their choice is probably just like kill the Roaming Sandspout Glyph and then they can do whatever they want. Like, this is going to be a real big magnet for removal because it's really annoying to have to choose between attacking or playing your spells. So I imagine it's going to die a lot, but still, if you add all this together, it's kind of a weird 5-mana mostly Wrath. Yeah, it's going to leave behind a creature probably, but at least it's going to be a small creature. So it's kind of like a weird Divine Reckoning. And then the backside is like a super upgraded Angelic Arbiter. The ability is essentially the same as Angelic Arbiter. The problem with Angelic Arbiter is 7 mana is like kind of a ton, and I know if you actually add together the mana of Unstable Glyph Bridge, it's 5 to cast, 5 more to craft, it actually adds up to 10, but in practical terms, 5 plus 5 is a lot of times a lot less than 7, because you can split it up. Your odds of getting to 5 mana in a game of Magic pretty high, but some games you won't actually even get to 7 mana, and you can still do the Unstable Glyph thing. So just how good is this card? I think it's mostly a card for specific decks. Remember, we're in a standard with busted Wrath, Sunfall, Farewell, some of the strongest standard Wraths we've seen in a long time because they just exile everything. So I think your generic blue-white control deck or whatever, Esper control deck, they're just going to still play the Sunfalls, still going to play the Farewells, but I think that Unstable Glyph Bridge, it has some really sneaky upsides in specific archetypes. To me, I see this as a card that's a really good Wrath, but only for specific decks. So first, in Standard, we have this weird permanent theme thanks to Descend. Unstable Glyph Bridge seems really good there. This is a Wrath that's technically an artifact, so in your graveyard, it's working for your Myco Tyrant or whatever. You're being able to exile it to other craft with an artifact cards. It also works well with artifact themed decks. Like, it lines up really well with Urza Lord Protector. Urza Lord Protector is a 2-power creature, so you can choose to keep your Urza. Plus, Urza cares about artifacts, it ramps you into artifacts, so it synergizes really well in some sort of Urza artifact deck. Once you get back to older formats, the same thing is true. This is a Wrath that you can cast with Emery from the graveyard. You can tap for mana with Urza Lord High Artificer. It reduces the cost of your Thought Monitors, so you get all those synergies there. And I think that's its main purpose in Commander. I was digging through commanders that could play this, and in Commander, the same thing I said about Standard is even more true. Commander has really good Wraths. You got Farewells and Austere Commands, and you got Vanquish the Horde. There's so many Wrath options in white that most decks, they just care about wrathing the board, are going to stick with the well-known, super popular, really good options. But there's some decks where Unstable Glyph Bridge is going to be absurd. So artifact decks, one obvious home, it's a Wrath that you can later sack to your Breya to get value out of your Breya's abilities. It works incredibly well with Teshar. Teshar cares about historic spells. Artifacts are historic. Plus, Teshar's 2 power, so it survives your Unstable Glyph Bridge. Works really well there. Stuff like Sidri. Sidri can survive Unstable Glyph Bridge and then turn into a big creature. Alayla. You can cast this. Alayla survives. You start making your tokens. Bellasaurus Crawl works really well there as well because it cares about tapping artifacts to big tokens. So in these decks, I think the Unstable Glyph Bridge is at least in the conversation because the Wrath side is good, and then you get the upside that the backside is actually going to be really annoying if in the late game you flip around to it. So I think for me, with these craft cards, I'm mostly evaluating them based on the power of the front side. Like, I think the front side needs to mostly stand alone because the craft part, it's a lot of extra mana. You need a bit of setup for it. There's certainly going to be times when it happens where in the late game, you just like got the perfect situation to craft. But I don't think you put this card in your deck with the expectation that you're realistically in the early game going to have a roaming sand spout. That's kind of like the bonus that you get in the late game sometimes. But I think Unstable Glyph Bridge, it's good enough just with its front side in the right deck that this can be a playable card. We also got another 3-drop vampire, this time a white one in Sanguine Evangelist. So 3 mana 2/1. Vampire Cleric, Battle Cry, so when it attacks, it gives your other attacking creatures +1/+0 until end of turn. Honestly, didn't know, is Battle Cry like an evergreen mechanic now? Battle Cry is not one of the mechanics of this set, right? Like, I did not know that Battle Cry was a thing that could show up in this set, but Battle Cry is cool, so that's fine. And then when it ETBs or dies, you create a 1/1 black bat creature token with flag. So Sanguine Evangelist kind of reminds me of Aether Channeler. It's like aggro Aether Channeler. Aether Channeler can come down for 3 mana as a 2/1, make a 1/1 flyer, but it has a bunch of other, like, you know, blinky, Panharmonicon-y value upsides. It's like, oh, I can draw a card, I can bounce something. Sanguine Evangelist, very similar in stats and token creation, but Evangelist, all about being aggressive. This wants to come down and make a token, slam into your opponent for a bunch of damage, make another token. That's going to be the main purpose of this card. So the downside of Sanguine Evangelist is it's a 2/1 that really wants to attack. So odds of this surviving multiple turns, probably not going to be super high. So I think you think of this almost like a weird sorcery, if that makes sense, where you like play this and get a token, hopefully get in one attack with it to get a bunch of damage and get another token and call it a day. It seems good in Edgar vampires. I was trying to look for vampires that are specifically about like token creation and going wide. So far, we don't have a ton of them. Edgar is the only one that really popped off the screen to me. The backside of it makes 1/1 tokens that work well with Sanguine Evangelist. I think this might actually not be a vampire card. Maybe it's more of a token card. It actually seems very good in some sort of deck that's just like going super wide. Battle Cry is most powerful when you have a ton of creatures on the battlefield. Every creature you get on the battlefield that can attack is one more power you're getting out of Sanguine Evangelist's ability. So maybe some sort of token deck that's just Resolute Reinforcements, Wedding Announcements, Mondrax, go as wide as possible, play this, get a token, smash in for a ton of damage, try to close out the game. So Sanguine Evangelist, I think it's okay. I think it's a card that has roles. Less hyped about this than some of the other vampires we've been talking about. The black 3-drop 2/4 Death Toucher. I think that's my favorite 3-drop vampire of the day by far. But I could certainly see this card playing a role in some sort of go wide deck where its Battle Cry ability and its ETB and Death Token ability line up really well and offer a lot of damage. Next up is a big ol' gnome in Threefold Thunderhulk. So 7 mana 0/0. Off to a good start. ETBs with 3 +1/+1 counters. When it ETBs or attacks, create a number of 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens equal to its power. Pay 2, sack another artifact, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So Threefold Thunderhulk, it's essentially a 7 mana 3/3 that makes 3 1/1s when it enters the battlefield without any additional shenanigans. I would say this is a Mere Battlesphere. Compared to Mere Battlesphere, it looks kind of bad, but it does have more shenanigans. You're not getting as much power on the battlefield, as many bodies on the battlefield immediately, but you can do some neat tricks with it. As far as standard is concerned, when you think about what 7 mana buys you, Atraxa Grand Unifiers, Itali Primal Conquerors, hard for me to imagine people are going to be ramping into the 7 mana 0/0. That said, it is an artifact, and there are some artifact ramp decks. We have seen these fringe, like, Power Stone ramp decks, and that's the one place where I could see Threefold Thunderhulk really shining, where your Mightstone and Weakstone and Thran Spiders, they can't ramp you into Atraxa and Italis, but they can ramp you into Threefold Thunderhulks and Cityscape Levelers, so I think that would probably be the main home for this card. In Commander, if you want to go super deep, like Doubling Seasons and Carrot Clan Ironworks, you can build a deck that can do ridiculous things with this card, where you double the counter, so that doubles the amount of 1/1s, then you sack the 1/1s to make mana and sack some to put counters on it, and then like attack with it and try to make like this huge board full of stuff, so you can do some cool shenanigans there. But overall, I think this is more like a fun finisher for artifact decks rather than a super push spiky top tier card for most decks. In the world of lower rarity cards, I got a few I want to mention individually. Poison Dart Frog, not a bad mana dork. 2 mana 1/1, taps to make a mana of any color. It has reach, which is a nice bonus, and then you can pay 2 to give it Death Touch until end of turn. So since in standard mana dorks essentially start at 2 mana now, I think this is a fine one. I like that in the late game, its Death Touch ability can turn it into a relevant creature on the battlefield. Mana dorks generally lose value as the game goes along because eventually you're going to have enough mana that you don't need 1 extra mana. But this is a mana dork that does have some relevance on turn 10 or whatever. When you have all this mana, you turn it into a Death Toucher and take down an Itali or a Shieldred, or maybe it keeps your opponent at bay. If you leave 2 mana up, going to be very hard for your opponent to attack their big creatures into this because you might just give it Death Touch. And also its ability is kind of like 1 mana in a weird way because on defense you can block with Poison Dart Frog, tap it to make a mana, and use that mana to activate its Death Touch ability. So in some sense it's even a little cheaper than it looks. We also got Coati Scavenger. So 3 mana 3/2 Raccoon. It has Descend 4. So when it enters a battlefield, if there's 4 more permanent cards in your graveyard, you can return a permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So this I just want to mention because it kind of looks like an Eternal Witness. It's way worse than Eternal Witness. Eternal Witness gets back any card from your graveyard. This only specifically gets back permanent cards, but we've been talking about these Descend decks that would theoretically be about aggressively milling. Plus, we've been talking about how one of the themes of Lost Caverns of Ixalan is permanents that work like spells, like the Artifact Wrath, the Artifact Divination. Coati Scavenger, in that context of graveyard-heavy theme and permanents that work like spells, might actually kind of be a pretty worthy Eternal Witness substitute for standard, at least. So, in older formats where actual Eternal Witness exists, I don't think you're playing this one, but in standard, this might be Eternal Witness at home, or Eternal Witness in the garbage pile, I guess. We also have maybe my favorite uncommon from the set so far in Spelunking, and it's not my favorite just because Spelunking's a funny word and I like saying it, but that is part of it. So Spelunking, 3 mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, then you put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. If it's a cave, you gain 4 life. Most importantly, lands you control enter the battlefield untapped. So Spelunking, it's kind of like a growth spiral, but it's a more expensive sorcery speed growth spiral, with the upside that all your lands are going to come into play untapped no matter what. All your janky budget lands, all your bounce lands, all your horrible lands, they're suddenly going to turn into really busted lands. So we've seen with Up a Beanstalk and other cards in the past that anything that cantrips when it enters the battlefield, it can't be too bad. Like, worst case, this is 3 mana cantrip. That's not ideal, but it's fine. The thing is, once this is on the battlefield, it kind of does the Amulet of Vigor thing. I don't think it's going to be that good in actual Amulet Titan in Modern, because part of the power of Amulet of Vigor is you can stack up multiples of them. If you have 2 amulets on the battlefield, you play a tap land, it's going to trigger both amulets, you untap it, you can tap it again for mana, it untaps again from the second amulet, you tap it again for mana. Spelunking can't do that. Once your lands enter the battlefield untapped, they just enter the battlefield untapped. So with amulets, if you have 2 of them, a single bounce land's generating 4 mana or something absurd. With Spelunking, if you have 10 of them, a single bounce land's still only ever going to be 2 mana. So maybe it could be like a one of backup or something in Amulet, but it's not going to replace Amulet in Amulet Titan. What makes me excited about this card, though, is this is like one of the best budget cards of all time. Like, this is a card that if you are someone who is not playing fetch lands and shock lands and original dual lands and playing a budget mana base that maybe has some tap lands and some guild gates and some bounce lands, this suddenly turns all your lands into untap lands, and it does it attached to an ETB cantripping extra land drop making card, so the cost is not high. It's not like you gotta play some horrible card to get your lands into play untapped. You're playing a slightly more expensive sorcery speed growth spiral. You're playing a explorer that costs 1 more mana, and the reward for that is suddenly your Simic Guildgate turns into a tropical island. Your Simic Growth Chamber comes into play untap, makes 2 mana. Your Hidden Volcano can come into play and discover right away if you needed to. I think the most obvious constructed home for this, and this is a card that I think any budget commander deck playing a bunch of tap lands, worth it. Throw it in, gonna be awesome. You're gonna love having it in your deck. What I'm most hyped for in constructed, though, is actually playing this in Gates. So I love playing the Gates deck in basically every format, and this is the perfect Gates card. So Gates is a really strong deck because it has really good payoffs. There are rewards for putting a bunch of Gates in your deck, drawing tons of cards, getting powerful Raz, winning with Maze's End. The problem is, Gates all come into play tapped, or essentially all come into play tapped, which makes your deck really, really slow. And it also makes your Maze's End slow clunky, because Maze's End comes into play tapped, so it's got to like sit out for a turn before you can try to win with it, which is awkward because of Ghost Quarters and Field of Ruins. Spelunking is built for the Gates deck. With a Spelunking out, all your Gates come into play untapped, so they're real lands. You can Maze's End combo kill right away, plus it's an Explore. It's like paying 1 more mana for Explore, and your reward is your deck becomes super powered. So I think this is the, well, maybe discounting Primeval Titan, which is kind of more of a finisher than a ramp spell, honestly, but discounting Primeval Titan, however you want to think of that, I think this is just the new best ramp spell for a Gates deck, because in that archetype in specific, having your lands come into play untapped is so powerful. So Spelunking, really hyped about this card. This is a super cool card. I'm excited to use it to power up budget commander decks. I'm excited to play it with Gates. There's probably some cool Lotus Field shenanigans. Your Lotus Field coming to play untapped seems kind of busted as well. So this one, absolutely love it. One of the coolest cards from the set. Finally today, got a few draft chaff commons and uncommons. You can find them all over at MTGPreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers for today. So what do you think? What are you most hyped about from today's spoilers? Let me know in the comments. And I'll be back tomorrow with even more Lost Caverns of Ixalan spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone. And I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can find yesterday's daily spoiler video here, or maybe the video about the most hated card from every year of Magic the Gathering.